The first sign that something was wrong with the winter came when the dead began walking out of their graves in the village of Frostholm, their frost-blue faces turned toward the mountains, as if answering a summons only they could hear. Astrid Ironwife saw them on the morning of the winter solstice, 3 weeks after the first snow had fallen and refused to melt, 3 weeks after the sun had stopped rising above the horizon and left them in a twilight that never brightened into day. She was drawing water from the well when she noticed old Thorvald shuffling past her house, which would have been unremarkable, except that Thorvald had been dead for 6 days, buried in the frozen ground after a wasting sickness had consumed him. Now he walked with the jerky, uncoordinated movements of a marionette whose strings were being pulled by unpracticed hands, his burial clothes hanging loose on his wasted frame, his eyes milky white and unseeing. Astrid dropped her bucket, the water splashing across the ice-covered ground, and screamed for her husband. Bjorn came running from the smithy, his hammer still in his hand, and stopped dead at the sight of the walking corpse. He was a man who had fought in a dozen battles, who had killed more men than he cared to count, but the sight of Thorvald's animated corpse froze him with a primal fear that combat had never inspired. Other villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by Astrid's scream, and they stood in shocked silence as Thorvald walked past them all, heading steadily toward the mountain pass that led north into the wilderness. He did not respond to their calls, did not acknowledge their presence, simply walked with terrible purpose toward some destination none of them could see. Then Sigrid appeared, emerging from her own grave at the edge of the village, and after her came Eric the fisherman, and Gudrun who had died in childbirth, and Knut who had frozen to death in a hunting accident. One by one the recent dead rose from their resting places and joined the procession, a silent parade of corpses walking north through the perpetual twilight, and the living could do nothing but watch in horror as their buried friends and family shambled past like sleepwalkers in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Bjorn was the first to break the paralysis of fear. He grabbed his axe and his warmest furs and announced he was following them, that he would discover where the dead were going and what was causing this abomination. Astrid begged him not to go, reminded him that they had 3 children who needed their father, that following corpses into the wilderness during the darkest winter in living memory was suicide. But Bjorn's face was set in grim lines, his jaw tight with determination. "Something is wrong with the world," he said quietly. "Something has broken in the natural order, and it will not fix itself. If I do nothing, if we all do nothing, this will not be the last horror we witness. I am a warrior. I have spent my life fighting human enemies. Perhaps it is time to fight something else." He was not alone in his decision. 5 other men of the village volunteered to join him: Orm Longhand, Leif the Hunter, Magnus, who had been a raider in his youth, and 2 younger men, Halvard and Eric, who were brave enough or foolish enough to think themselves capable of facing whatever waited in the north. They gathered supplies, weapons, anything that might be useful against an unknown enemy, and set out following the trail of the dead. The corpses left tracks in the snow, deep furrows where frozen feet dragged through the drifts, and the trail was easy to follow, even in the dim light that passed for day. The journey north took them through country that grew increasingly hostile with each mile. The temperature dropped until breathing felt like inhaling knives, until exposed skin froze in minutes, until even the trees seemed to huddle together for warmth. The perpetual twilight deepened into something darker, a gloom that pressed against them like a physical weight, making it hard to think, hard to remember why they were here or where they were going. Bjorn forced them forward through sheer will, refusing to let the darkness claim them, refusing to give up when every instinct screamed that they should turn back while they still could. On the 3rd day, they found the source of the corruption. The trail of the dead led to a massive cave in the side of a mountain, a wound in the earth that exhaled cold air and something else, something that smelled of decay and dark magic and ancient evil. The corpses were disappearing into that cave, walking into the darkness without hesitation, and from deep within came sounds that made the warriors grip their weapons tighter, chanting in a language none of them recognized, the crackle of unnatural fire, and beneath it all a sound like breathing, slow and deep and massive, as if something enormous was sleeping in the depths, and the dead were being offered as tribute to keep it sleeping. Bjorn did not hesitate. He lit a torch, raised his axe and led his companions into the cave. The passage descended steeply, the walls pressing close, the air growing colder and fouler with each step. They passed chambers filled with the standing dead, corpses arranged in rows like soldiers awaiting orders, their milky eyes staring at nothing. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drawn from graves across the entire region, all waiting in this terrible place for something that Bjorn could not begin to imagine. The passage opened into a vast cavern, and what Bjorn saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. At the center of the cavern stood a figure wrapped in robes that seemed woven from shadows and frost, its face hidden beneath a hood, but its hands visible, skeletal and glowing with a pale blue light. The figure stood before an altar carved from black ice, and on that altar lay a body, but not a corpse. This was something that had never lived, something being constructed from pieces of the dead, limbs and organs harvested and arranged in a pattern that suggested horrible purpose. Around the altar, the dead stood in concentric circles, swaying slightly, and from their mouths came the chanting that echoed through the cavern, words in a tongue that predated human language, words that made reality itself seem to shiver and warp. The robed figure turned toward the warriors, and though Bjorn could not see its face, he felt its attention like frost crawling across his skin. When it spoke, its voice was like the grinding of glaciers, like the crack of breaking ice, like the howl of winter wind given words. You should not have come here, living ones. This is a place of death and transformation, a sacred space where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. What is happening here is beyond your comprehension, beyond your ability to prevent. The long winter has begun, and it will not end until the work is complete, until enough of the dead have been gathered, until the vessel is ready to receive what must be received. "What are you?" Bjorn demanded, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "What are you doing with the dead? What is this vessel you are building?" "I am the last Völva," the figure said, and there was something in its tone that might have been pride or might have been madness. "The final inheritor of knowledge that your people have forgotten, magic that was old when your gods were young. I am preparing for the end of this age and the beginning of the next. The world is dying, warrior. Surely you have felt it. The winters grow longer, the summers shorter, the sun weaker with each turning of the seasons. This is Fimbulwinter, the prelude to Ragnarok, and when the final battle comes, when the gods themselves fall, humanity will be defenseless unless I complete my work. I am building a guardian, a protector formed from the essence of the dead, powered by their collective strength, guided by their collective wisdom. When the monsters come from Muspelheim and the giants march from Jotunheim, this guardian will stand against them, will protect what remains of humanity in the world that comes after." "You are mad," Bjorn said flatly. "You are defiling the dead, stealing them from their rest, using them for purposes they never consented to. Whatever you think you are building, whatever you believe you are protecting, you have no right to do this. The dead deserve peace, not enslavement." The last Völva laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Peace? What is peace to the dead when the world of the living faces extinction? They have already passed beyond caring, beyond suffering. I am giving their remnants purpose, using what they have left behind to save what they left behind. Would they not choose this if they understood what was at stake? Would they not willingly sacrifice their rest to preserve their children and grandchildren from the horrors that are coming? You do not have the right to make that choice for them," Bjorn replied, and he raised his axe. "I am ending this. Whatever you are doing here, whatever you think you are accomplishing, it stops now." He charged forward, and his companions followed, weapons raised, shouting war cries that echoed through the cavern. The standing dead moved to intercept them, not attacking, but simply blocking their path, their bodies forming a wall of cold flesh between the warriors and the Völva. Bjorn's axe took the first corpse out, but the body did not fall, simply continued standing, headless, still blocking his way. He cut through it, hacked his way forward, but for every corpse he destroyed, 2 more took its place, and behind him he could hear his companions struggling, fighting against opponents who felt no pain and could not be intimidated. The last Völva raised her skeletal hands, and the temperature in the cavern plummeted. Ice began forming on the warriors' weapons, on their armor, on their exposed skin. Bjorn felt his movements slowing, his muscles stiffening, frost creeping across his vision. He was going to die here. he realized. They all were. They had come expecting to fight an enemy they could understand, and instead they had walked into forces beyond their comprehension, magic and madness combined in ways that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Then Halvard did something unexpected. The young warrior dropped his sword and pulled from his pack an object Bjorn had not known he carried, a small wooden idol carved in the shape of a woman with exaggerated features, very old, the kind of protective charm that grandmothers gave to their grandchildren. Halvard held it high and began speaking, not in Norse but in something older, words that sounded like the ones the Völva had been using but different, gentler, less commanding and more pleading. He was praying, Bjorn realized, not to the gods but to something else, something older than gods, the spirits that had been worshipped before the Aesir came to the north. The effect was immediate. The standing dead stopped moving, their bodies going rigid, and the chanting that had filled the cavern ceased abruptly. The last Völva screamed, a sound of rage and despair combined, and the shadows that formed her robes began to dissolve, revealing what lay beneath, not a person but a collection of bones held together by will and magic, a thing that had been human once but had sacrificed its flesh and its humanity in pursuit of power and purpose. No, the Völva shrieked, you cannot stop this. The work must be completed. The Guardian must be finished, or all will be lost. Do you not understand what is coming? Do you not see the darkness gathering at the edges of the world? I see a darkness here, Halvard said, his voice shaking but determined. I see someone who has gone so far down the wrong path that they can no longer recognize it as wrong. Whatever threat you fear, whatever end you believe is coming, this is not the way to face it. The dead must rest, the living must endure. That is the natural order, and you have broken it. Now it will be restored. He pressed the wooden idol against the black ice altar, and cracks began spreading through it, spreading through the floor, through the walls, through the very foundations of the cavern. The last Völva reached toward him, her skeletal hands grasping, but she was falling apart now, the magic that sustained her unraveling, her bones scattering like dropped sticks. The standing dead collapsed all at once, hundreds of corpses falling to the cavern floor as whatever had animated them fled, or dissipated, or returned to wherever such things originated. The unfinished Guardian on the altar shuddered once, and then decomposed with unnatural speed, flesh rotting away in seconds, bones turning to dust, until nothing remained but a stain on the black ice. "Run!" Bjorn shouted, and they ran, scrambling back up the passage as the cavern collapsed behind them, the mountain itself seeming to reject what had been done within its depths. They emerged into the twilight to find that something had changed in the quality of the darkness. It was still dim, still cold, but the oppressive weight was gone, the sense of wrongness lifted, and on the horizon, for the first time in 3 weeks, they saw a faint glow that suggested the sun was trying to rise. The journey back to Frostholm took 4 days, moving slowly through country that was beginning, imperceptibly, to warm. By the time they reached the village, the sun was visible again, a pale disk that hung just above the horizon for a few precious hours each day. It was not full daylight, not yet, but it was a promise that full daylight would return, that winter would not last forever, that the world had been pulled back from whatever brink it had been approaching. The villagers greeted them as heroes, and Bjorn allowed them to think he deserved the title, even though he knew the truth. He had not saved them, Halvard had, with an old wooden idol and prayers to spirits Bjorn did not understand. But when Bjorn tried to speak of this, tried to give the young warrior the credit he deserved, Halvard shook his head and refused the praise. "We all did what needed doing," he said simply. "That is enough." Life slowly returned to normal, or something approximating normal. The dead stayed buried. The sun climbed higher with each passing day. Spring came, late but genuine, and with it the understanding that they had survived something terrible, something that most of them would never fully comprehend. Bjorn tried to explain what they had seen in the cave, tried to describe the last Völva and her mad plan to build a guardian for the end times, but the words felt inadequate, insufficient to capture the reality of what they had faced. Astrid listened to his story and held him while he shook with the memory of it. "Do you think she was right?" she asked quietly. "Do you think Ragnarok is truly coming, that the world is ending?" "I do not know," Bjorn admitted. Perhaps she was right about that, even if she was wrong about everything else. Perhaps the world is dying, and all we can do is try to live well in the time we have left. But I know this. Building monsters to fight monsters is not the answer. Defiling the dead to protect the living is not the answer. If the end comes, we will face it as ourselves, human and flawed and mortal, not as something twisted into shapes that betray everything we are. Years passed, and Bjorn grew old watching his children grow, and his grandchildren being born. The winters remained long, but they were not endless. The sun continued to rise and set in its appointed times. And if sometimes Bjorn woke in the night from dreams of standing dead and skeletal Völvas, if sometimes he wondered whether he had truly stopped anything or merely delayed the inevitable, he kept those fears to himself. He had done what he could, had faced darkness and survived, and that was all any mortal could do. The rest was in the hands of the gods, or the spirits, or whatever forces moved beneath the surface of the world, shaping destinies that men could glimpse but never fully understand. On the hill above Frostholm, where the villagers had built a cairn to honor the warriors who had ventured north, Astrid carved runes that told a simplified version of the story, leaving out the parts that seemed too strange or too frightening for future generations to believe. The inscription read, "In the dark winter when the dead walked, 6 warriors followed them into the mountain and brought back the light. May their courage be remembered when darkness comes again." And beneath that, in smaller runes visible only to those who looked closely, she added words that Bjorn had spoken to her in private, words he believed but could never prove. The end is always coming. What matters is what we do in the time between now and then. We love, we fight, we endure, and that is enough. The wooden idol that Halvard had used to break the Völva's magic was placed in the village temple, a sacred object now, though no one could quite explain what made it powerful or how a young warrior had known to carry it into battle. Halvard himself never spoke of it, and when he died many years later, the secret died with him. But parents began giving similar idols to their children, and those children to theirs, and the tradition continued down through generations, a protection against darkness that might or might not work, but that people held on to anyway, because sometimes faith was all you had when you faced the unknown. And in the deep places of the mountains, where caves wound into darkness and ancient magic still lingered in the stones, some said you could still hear echoing whispers, the last traces of a Völva who had tried to save the world by destroying it, who had believed so completely in her righteous purpose that she could not see how far she had fallen from righteousness. But whether those whispers were real or merely the wind playing tricks, whether the threat she had warned against was genuine or delusion, no one could say for certain. The world continued, and people continued to live in it, and that was perhaps the only answer that mattered.